anglais puisque cette session va être en anglais. Donc, à partir de maintenant, je vais faire la présentation du séminaire et de nos invités en anglais, mais bienvenue à tous et à toutes pour cette session du séminaire du réseau numéro 44 de l'Association française de sociologie, justice sociale et critique, théorie de l'émancipation et pratique. So now I switch to English. So this is the one of the sessions of the seminar Which Internationalism. This is the seminar of the network number 44 from the French Association for Sociology. This network is entitled Social Justice and Critics, Emancipatory Theories and Practices. And today we are going to work on social justice and international legal norms from the sociological point of view, but also law. And the session will be held in English. So my fellow David Mélo from Chambéry is here, but he cannot speak, so maybe he will appear during the session. And my name is Emmanuelle Barozet. We are connected with Jorge from Chile. I'm French and Chilean, and I work in Chile. And this part of this seminary is organized also by our research center, el Centro de Estudios para la Cohesión y el Conflicto Social. So today we have two guests, Polina Cazals from University of Savoie Mont Blanc, and Jorge Atria, researcher and professor in sociology at University Diego Portales in Santiago in Chile. And I will be the discussant of the session, unless, of course, David fixes his problems with his computer. So I'll make a brief presentation. So taxation is a subject that is little investigated in sociology, but it is naturally relevant to the work of social sciences on social justice, particularly through the issue of equality, redistribution, freedom, etc. The question of tax justice is not one of the privileged subject of sociology, but the contributions of economic history the last decades in the context of repeated global and national economic crisis has widened the field for sociology. The question of who gets what in our societies and the contribution of all to social and economic well-being now has a privileged place in the field of social justice, while national and comparative law have more and more elements to understand the role of taxes in the equilibria or disequilibria in our societies. To what extent is international tax justice finding expression in concrete achievements? There is indeed a certain amount of activity and a wealth of news in the field of international tax standards. For example, to take a few significant examples, we need only think of the debates on tax havens, the GAFA tax, or the international standard issued by the OECD for the recovery of VAT on transnational sales. But what can these international standards do about the principle of state sovereignty? So in this seminar with Polina and Jorge, we propose to question this subject from a set of cross-disciplinary perspective, law and sociology, respectively. In this session, with the presentation of Polina Cazals on social justice and international tax laws from a legal perspective, we will first see what the current context is. This will allow us to ask major questions, such as where are we in terms of equal treatment before the law, before tax law, the principle of non-discrimination, the link between taxes and democracy, or what tax justice is, whether in France, in Europe, or within international organizations. Once this general picture has been drawn up from a legal point of view, we will go deeper in the field of sociology with Jorge Atria. Why should sociology work in the field of taxation at the same level as law, political science, or economics? Indeed, in the global context of economic accumulation, global crisis, and criticism on the contribution of the elites, international norms are coming back to the forefront, in particular the lack of coordination and harmonization, which allows for spaces without regulation. We will then look at the particularity of the Latin American context in the case of taxation before presenting the case of Chile, which is currently redefining its social pact. Chile is a case study because of its legalistic culture, but with weak laws, and that allows for an interpretation favorable to the elites, while a large part of society demands a strong redistribution, particularly in the tax field. So that's the general presentation of this seminar. We will begin the session with Polina Cazals, and then with Jorge Atria, and each one has 30 minutes to present. Both have slides, so we have that kind of help. And then we'll have about 45 minutes to discuss with the person present today. So Polina, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this presentation. And I'm just wanted to say how happy I am to be here today and to have this opportunity to talk to persons who are not necessarily specialists in taxation, because well, as I will develop it later on, just a second. Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
No.
It's your desk, actually.
Yes,
okay.
It's your desk.
Okay, sorry. I'll try it again. Can you see my presentation now?
Yes, it's okay.
Perfect. Okay, so yes, I was saying how happy I am to be here, because for specialists of tax law, justice is not an easy concept. As I will develop it a little bit later, it's a concept we are not used to work with it. And it starts only to take an extreme importance since 2008 and the financial crisis. So it actually worked on this seminar made me realize how present this concept was in tax law, but it was always an underlying issue, never apparent, never really called as such. We never referred to justice, but nevertheless present. So I will really be happy to present the maybe specific features of the approach to justice and equality in law in general, in taxation specifically, and then to have your remarks and your observations to enrich my understanding of this concept. So,
Polina,
yes.
you're not in presentation mode. We see both of your slides.
Okay. Is it better?
Yes, maybe you could click on the this one. Yeah, this one.
But if I do this, it will be.
Oh, okay.
See?
Okay, that's fine. Yes, that's okay.
Maybe I know, I have an idea. Wait a second. Maybe if I'm doing it the other way around. If I do like this and like this, is it better? Are you seeing both slides, or is it better?
Yeah,
like
yeah, but it's okay. Don't worry. We can
I'm
read
sorry.
it.
I'm sorry. Okay. So as I was saying, why talk about social justice and international taxation? And it will not be only on international taxation, but it will, the main purpose of my presentation is to bring this issue to this question of justice and international taxation, because it has taken more and more of importance in recent years. It first appeared in political statements of OECD, European Organization of Economic and Commercial Development, and EU statements also in the European Union, in particular European Commission, started to mention tax fairness, tax equality, fair share of taxation, etc. So we started to have a vocabulary specific about justice, which we never heard in tax law. So that's for this rather recent aspect. However, as I was saying, actually it was an underlying concern for tax law for centuries. But there really is a switch from the way it was used in domestic law to the way it is now used in international context. In domestic law, all issues that we will study which concern, that I more or less tried to connect with the idea of justice, they were either connected with the political approach, for example, the issue of democracy. A tax law which is considered to be just traditionally is a tax law which is adopted by parliament. It is just because it is adopted by parliament. And therefore, behind, there were also the connection with economic theories and with political positions. So if we had more right political parties in parliament, they will choose specific economic theories to justify some type of decision. And if you had more, let's say, left-wing political parties, they will take other economic theories and defend other political choices, and that will change the substance of tax law. When we started to think about justice in international, it is used to legitimate reforms in international context, but it is presented as a sort of objective opinion, a truth. So it does not depend on any economic theory. It does not depend on the political position of parties, even though in practice we do see that the political changes in the United States, for example, have direct impact on the possible reforms on international taxation. But in the political way of presenting it, in political statements, it is presented as the truth and not an opinion or a political position. And therefore, if before in domestic law, we could find arguments in favor or against specific economic theories, specific tax content. So here we have no more arguments. That really is something which strikes me most in recent years. We have arguments on how to achieve purposes presented as connected to justice, how to achieve tax fairness, but we never have a discussion on what do we mean by tax fairness. This is really a kind of a concept that closes the discussion. It is also interesting to see, I think, well, this is my personal theory, but at least I present it as such, not as a truth. I think we use this term in international context of justice because we are in relations between states. They are equal and they are all sovereign. So there is actually very few, very limited legal tools to try to make a pressure on a state to change its legislation or its position on some issues. So faced with this lack of legal tools, I think states use moral concepts of justice, saying that such legislation is harmful, is unfair, it brings unfair results, etc. So it's a kind of mean of a moral pressure. So how did we get from this traditional domestic approach to this international new trends? I will present it to you in several steps. Well, we love plans in law. It's all very structured. So I didn't do the traditional French plan in 2 parts, but it's still has some kind of structure. So I will just say several words to the way law works, because I think it's a little bit different from other social sciences. And then I'll say several words about the concept of justice and in particular equality, because I understood that social justice is mainly about equality. So about some words about the way equality is approached in all branches of law. And then we go specifically to tax law and see how it worked in purely domestic concept before going to more international issues. Oops, sorry. So how does law work? Well, the main specific feature of law, I think, is that we study only legal norms. We don't study behavior, we don't study, we take into account practice. So the way norms are applied in practice, the effects they produce in practice, this can be studied in law, but it is a rather limited part of legal studies. And when we study practice, it is always brought to the issue of legal norms, connected to legal norms. So if it doesn't work well in practice, what do we have to change in legal norms to make it work? If in practice it has effects that have not been foreseen and that are not complying with the purpose of the legislator, what do we have to change in the legal norms? So we are focused very much on legal norms. And that's why the whole presentation of mine I'll talk to you mainly about legal norms. Also, a specific feature of modern legal systems is that you have a huge diversity of legal norms. You have a lot of domestic legal norms, you have a lot of international legal norms, you have European Union, which has huge influence in tax law, even though tax law, it's the competence of member states. And so European Union is not supposed to act in this area. Nevertheless, it does because it is required to attain its objectives. So we have really very different norms adopted by different bodies with different effects. And the heart of a legal know-how today is the way to interpret and articulate these norms, how they apply together to the same situation. Well, the traditional way of articulating norms, even though it's not the only one in particular in the modern legal system, but I think it still can be interesting to present, is through the hierarchy, what is called the hierarchy of legal norms. We consider that in all legal system, you have a fundamental norm, which is the Constitution. And all other legal norms shall comply with this fundamental norm. And if they do not comply, they are illegal mainly. And so they are normally stop to exist. So either retrospectively or not, it depends on different situations, but all other norms should comply with the Constitution. In France, the particular feature of the whole thing is that, for example, at each level, you find very different norms. And in particular, what is called Constitution actually covers different norms. So it's the French Constitution of 1958, of course, but it is also the Declaration of Human and Civic Rights of 1789. So it's a text which dates back to the French Revolution, which is initially a political statement, not a legal document. But the modern French Constitution refers expressly to values and rights mentioned in this declaration, and the Constitutional Council considered that by this reference of the French Constitution to the Declaration of Human Rights, it has given the same legal value to the Declaration of Human and Civic Rights as the Constitution. So now it's compulsory. It has the same value as the Constitution itself. And it's important because we will talk a lot about specifically provisions of this Declaration of Human and Civic Rights. Same way for international treaties. Here we find international tax treaties, of course, bilateral, negotiated by two states, according to the OECD or United Nations models. Mostly OECD is the most famous model for tax treaties. You also find here European Convention of Human Rights. And you also have among these international treaties that founded the European Union. And well, it's a huge legal discussion on who is more important, EU law or domestic constitution or other international treaties. But let's say, at least from domestic French perspective, EU law is on the level of international treaties. In statutes, you have, of course, acts of parliament, and they play a fundamental role in tax law because according to Article 34 of the French Constitution, all tax rules should be adopted by Parliament. So normally it's the only source of compulsory rules in tax law. These are only acts of Parliament. So mainly finance acts with the budget of the state for the next year. These are the main sources of tax rules, which are gathered in specific tax codes in France. And then you can have administrative regulations, which we don't play a very important role in tax law. However, they can bring important details, specific indications on the way acts of parliament should be applied. The specific issue in French legal system is the status of case law. Judicial decisions traditionally are not considered to be a source of law, so they are not considered as a legal norm. Judges are supposed only to apply law, but they cannot create it, they cannot create a legal rule. But that's a very, historic traditional approach. In practice, case law has a huge impact in the way norms are applied. Specifically in the modern legal system, with all this diversity of legal norms, judges actually make it work. So without them, the whole system doesn't work, and they have a huge impact on the result of how it will work. It is particularly so for the European Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights, because these are courts more inspired by common law systems in which judges traditionally play a very important role, and case law is a source of law as such. So it also contributed to strengthen the influence of judges. Okay, so how do we deal with justice in law? Well, the word justice as such appears mainly among people who belong to what is called the natural law approach. The difference between two approaches is to say that under positive law approach or existing law approach, we consider that legal norms or legal rules are only the ones that are adopted by human beings, be it by referendum, by parliament, doesn't matter. Under the natural law approach, the people who support this approach, they consider that there are freedoms and rights, and to a certain extent obligations, that pre-exist, that exist no matter happens, even if they are not recognized by people, they still exist. And that means that if you have a political regime that does not recognize human rights, for example, it can violate these human rights. And these violations can be sanctioned, for example, later on once the regime falls. So those who support this natural law approach will more easily talk about justice as something pre-existing goal, whereas in positive law, it does not really, it's rarely used, let's put it this way. However, natural law approach can be reflected, can be incorporated into existing law. And here we have an example with the preamble of the Declaration of Human and Civic Rights, 1789, saying that National Assembly recognizes and declares. So it recognizes the rights, human rights that pre-exist. It is only here to declare them, to recognize them, but it's not creating these rights. So it's inspired, this declaration is inspired by this natural law approach. Once we focus more on the existing rules, which is still closer to legal approach, and from my perspective, I'm more a positivist because I consider natural law approach is very important. It's not to say that I'm against human rights or anything like that. It's just that for me, it's closer to philosophical or moral areas more than to law. Law for me is more about compulsory rules adopted by a sovereign entity. So if we focus on existing law, we can search for justice in the content of rules. But here, as I say, mostly is just what the sovereign people says is just. And people who are supposed to be sovereign, they can say it either by referendum. That's rare, it does not exist in the tax area, but in some countries it's possible. Or it can say what is just through its representatives in parliament. So we have a kind of connection, very strong connection in law between justice and democracy. It's just what is democratically adopted. We can later on discuss whether it's a good idea or not, whether we can oppose, because now, for example, you say that a vote against human rights can be sanctioned by European justice, even if it is adopted by referendum. So we consider protection of human rights is more important than democracy. We can discuss about these issues later on, but at least it's an important issue. And you can talk about justice, not regarding the content of rules, but the way they are applied. And here, for example, one can think about equity, which is a very important concept in common law systems. It was a separate, in UK, it was a separate system of courts that were supposed to judge, to have more freedom in applying rules, more flexibility in order to obtain a just result, an equitable result. And these courts have invented the concept of trust, which is so famously known all through the world nowadays. You see, focus on the equity was here in the way rules are applied and not in the way they are drafted. And we have similar experiences in France. And that is very interesting because, as I said, in France, traditionally, judges considered as strictly applying law. They should not have this freedom of adjusting the result to what they seem to be equitable or just. However, even in tax area, which is particularly dependent on the acts of parliament, as we said, in Constitution, it says only acts of parliament can be source of law. Even in this area, we do have many decisions in different times, let's say, beginning of 20th century, end of 20th century, recent decisions, where judges say they interpret law. They won't say they create legal rules, but they interpret law in a way which takes a lot of freedom with the text. It's almost contra legem, as we call it in law, so it's almost against the way what is written in the legal norm, in order to achieve a result that they consider to be just. So we still have the same approach, focusing on equity, even in France. But it seems to me that social justice is not any kind of justice, it's more about equality. And equality is something which is very well known in law. And that's, at this point, I realized how much social justice actually is present in tax law, even though we don't really talk about it. These are fundamental principles in all branches of law about equal treatment and non-discrimination. I put them together because basically it's the same idea. And you will see there's just a slight difference in the way it works. The general idea of all these rules in law is that you can only treat in the same way situations that are comparable or similar. So different situations sometimes must be treated differently, sometimes can be treated differently. That depends on jurisdictions, on courts who consider the issue. But in any case, you cannot you cannot criticize the legislator if he treats differently situations that are different. But once we've said that, you see coming the main problem, because all situations present some differences. This is inevitable, okay? So how do you decide which differences justify different treatment? And what kind of differences do not justify different treatment? So the main problem of principles of equal treatment and non-discrimination in law is what are the criteria of differentiating the situations, of considering them comparable. And that's where the non-discrimination works differently from the principle of equal treatment. If you see the principle of non-discrimination, I gave you the example of the European Convention of Human Rights. They say that you should not discriminate on any grounds such as sex, race, color, language, religion, political opinion, etc. So we see that the criteria of differentiations, some criteria of this differentiation are prohibited. You cannot treat differently women and men. You cannot treat differently Catholics and Muslims, etc., etc. Okay, so you have the criteria on which you cannot distinguish situations. Whereas when you have a principle of equal treatment, like Article 6 of the Declaration of Human and Civic Rights, 1789, it says the law must be the same for all. So you don't have any information on the criteria to distinguish situations, when they are comparable and when they are not comparable. So it will be up to judge, and in France to the Constitutional Council, to decide on this criteria. In area of tax law, I will go directly to focus on the equal treatment because we have already talked about democracy. In equal treatment, the criteria, well, you can apply the Article 14, the non-discrimination provision, and there are other non-discrimination provisions other than the European Convention of Human Rights. And I gave you the example, for example, in EU law, you cannot discriminate, you cannot make different treatment based on nationality. On the international tax treaties, it's the same. You cannot treat differently persons, taxpayers, depending on their nationality. European Convention on Human Rights, there are other criteria that are prohibited. But regarding the principle of equality, you have talked about equality in front of law or in front of taxes. I choose the in law or in taxes. I don't know what is the right translation in English, to be honest. Well, the idea is that in the first equality, what I call equality in law, is that the law shall apply equally to all taxpayers. Okay, that is principle which is not specific to tax law. It applies to all branches of law. And the Constitutional Council says that for the application of this principle, the main feature is the objective, the purpose of the legislator. So if the criteria of distinction between situations is relevant regarding the purpose of the legislator, it satisfies the principle of equal treatment. If not, it does not satisfy the principle of equal treatment. I will give you an example just afterwards. Whereas the principle of equality, what I call in tax, it's more about spreading the burden of taxation among taxpayers. So it's not about the way the law is formulated. It's more about the way the tax is assessed at the level of each taxpayer and the burden it presents for him. So here the criteria of distinction will be the ability to pay. So some very quick example. You have a decision of the Constitutional Council on the, it was a decision on the Finance Act. And in this Finance Act, there was an article, a provision establishing a new carbon contribution. So the purpose of this carbon contribution was to reduce the emissions of carbon and to slow the warming of the world. And the problem was that the most polluting industries would have be obliged to pay such a big money, such huge amounts of this carbon contribution, that they have made lobbying against these provisions, and they demonstrated that it will be the end of their activities. It will be financially impossible for them to pay this contribution. Therefore, the legislator exempted them from the contribution. And so the question that was raised in front of the Constitutional Council was whether it was possible, whether it was complying with the principle of equal treatment to exempt these most polluting industrial activities. And the Constitutional Council reasoning is always in two steps. You see, so the first step, we do consider this different treatment. There is a different treatment. And second step, are they in a comparable situation or in a different situation? And the criteria of distinction here is the level of pollution. So is it a relevant criteria regarding the purpose of the legislator? If the purpose of the legislator was to reduce carbon emissions, it is not a relevant criteria. It should be the other way around. Most polluting industrial activities should pay more. And so the Constitutional Council will consider that it is a form of violation of the principle of equal treatment, because the legislator distinguished situations on a criteria which was not relevant regarding the purpose of the legislator.
Excusez-moi, Polina, il vous reste 5 minutes pour le contrôle du temps.
I will try to get quicker to the end. So the second principle is the ability to pay. This is a fundamental principle which is also you can find in most Western countries. It works very differently from the principle of equality. And in most countries, it will not be part of the principle of equality. But it happens that in France, it is considered as part of the principle of equality. And it says that the burden of taxation should be spread between taxpayers regarding their ability to pay. So here, you will not compare the situation of one taxpayer with the situation of the other taxpayer. You will only look whether the burden of taxation is excessive or not regarding the ability to pay. So maybe I will not stay very long on it because it's rather distant from the equal treatment. Just to say that indeed in France, also the question of compliance in tax law is connected with the principle of equality. And the fight against tax fraud and tax evasion is considered as connected with the principle of equality, because if one person can violate tax law, it's a breach of equality. And if everyone violates tax law, it's not the reach of equality, but the state cannot subsist. So it is connected, but strangely, maybe or maybe not, it doesn't raise any difficulties. And all other discussions we can have on the fight against tax fraud and tax evasion or on the compliance, they will not focus on under the approach of the equality about this subject. They will only focus on efficiency. Maybe still you have an interesting issue here is the issue of balance because the fighting against tax fraud and tax evasion justifies the infringement of certain rights and freedoms of the taxpayer. And so maybe an interesting question is how far you can go in this infringement in the name of protecting the equality. Well, so coming to the international, finally, justice in international tax law. So here I just gave you some examples of political statements using the concepts of fairness and equity in tax justice. So is it more than a political term? It's difficult to say, but in any case, it is used in legal proceedings when adopting legal norms. You have a very interesting article written by Alice Perlot on the tax fairness, where the author considers that you have threefold dimension of tax fairness. It's about business dimension, protecting the competition between companies. In law, protecting competition is mainly like principle of equality, is protecting the equal treatment of companies. You have the state dimension, fighting the harmful tax competition among states. Here, it's an interesting issue because traditionally tax competition among states was considered by economists as a good phenomenon because it makes pressure on states to levy less taxes and to better use the money they get from the taxpayer. However, it's a good phenomenon only if it has limited scope. And prior, if you were considering to move to a different state or to locate your activity in a different state, you must construct a business plan for that. And you should take specific means and to organize this location in a different state. So it limited the impact of tax competition between states. Whereas nowadays, a combined effect of some legal fictions, such as legal personality, with the globalization and digitalization of the economy, makes the scope of the tax competition between states huge. And that actually, this is where the problem is. And so the fairness today is to limit this tax competition between states. And there is the social dimension, the most difficult one, which refers to citizens' perception of the tax system. And that's where the Commission, for example, European Commission is talking about the companies paying their fair share of taxation. But what is a fair share of taxation? Who can determine it? Among recent projects of G20 and OECD, and I will finish on this slide, you have projects which aim only to protect and reinforce the compliance on international level. Mainly, well, the anti-BEPS project had 15 different actions, but most of these actions were aimed at fighting tax fraud and tax evasion. So they were mainly about compliance. This anti-BEPS project is over. Most of their actions and recommendations have been implemented by states. And so now we're in a situation where OECD is measuring the result, the efficiency, start to measure the efficiency of these recommendations. But in any case, it has been implemented. Whereas there are two other ongoing projects by the OECD. These are Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. Maybe you have heard about it. There were lots of written topics and discussions about it in the general press. And so the Pillar 1, well, I'll actually start with Pillar 2, because it's really actually the threefold approach of the tax justice. You can find it here. The second approach, the Pillar 2, is about fighting against harmful tax competition among states. The idea is that if one state adopts very attractive tax measures, the tax gain, the tax advantages that it grants to companies will be compensated in other states. So if a company pays 10 euros less in one state, it will pay 10 euro plus in the other state. So it will neutralize effects of this tax incentives, okay? And the pillar one, that's the most problematic part, because pillar one is about taxing the profits of companies in the digitalized economy, where they can make big profits in the market without physical presence in this market. And so here, why it is a problem? Because you actually are splitting one cake among many states. So if you give more taxation rights to one state, that means that the other state will be able to tax less. So here, this concept of fairness and justice should be opposed with economic interests of different states. And these economic interests are different and often opposed to one another. So this is something that OECD have some troubles to overcome these difficulties. Well, that's not the most important thing. And just maybe to like a conclusion, that now we see sometimes opposition between tax justice in international context and domestic context, because many states have introduced a specific tax to be able to tax profits of the GAFAM, the Google, Amazon, Facebook, etc. But in order for this tax to be effective, and maybe I will have some time in the discussion to later explain it, or maybe not, but in such case, just believe me, to be able to tax it, they had to make it on the turnover. If it was a tax on income of these companies, tax treaties will not allow states to levy these taxes. They are drafted in such a way that they will not allow it. So to overcome tax treaties, states adopted taxes on turnover, but turnover does not reflect the ability to pay. So you have a tax which reinforces the payment of fair share of taxation by certain big companies, but which is contrary, or at least which is in a very discussable situation regarding the principle of ability to pay. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Polina. Now we'll listen to Jorge Atria, and as you saw, David Mélo says he still has the same problem with his camera and microphone. So, Jorge, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. Can you see my presentation now? Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to this session. I will present some aspects of a fiscal sociology perspective, particularly regarding taxes and also the role of state. And then I will concentrate on a specific issue, which is tax non-compliance based on empirical work I conducted with economic elites in Chile. So the contents of this presentation are, first of all, these elements of fiscal sociology perspective and the role of state. Then I will provide also some information regarding Latin America, and with it, why it's important to analyze and study countries of the Global South to understand the role of taxes and the importance of the relation between individual and state. Then some information regarding non-compliance, both in Latin America and Chile. And here I will also present some information regarding the tax system in Chile. And then, based on a specific paper which I have already published, the method, the empirical method, some findings, and the discussion in which I consider both the paper and also the initial reflections of sociology, fiscal sociology, and elites. And I will also conclude with some policy implications. And here I just try to discuss at a broader level which consequences do tax avoidance have, and what can states do to have a better performance. So to begin with, what's the focus of the fiscal sociology perspective? Above all, fiscal sociology understands taxes as an indicator of large-scale changes in the economy and society. Taxes formalize our obligations to each other. They define the inequalities we accept and those that we collectively seek to redress. They signify who is member of our political community, how wide we draw the circle of we, and therefore they set the boundaries of what our governments can do. As some authors argue, in the modern world, taxation is the social contract. I use a fiscal sociology definition of taxes, and this is the definition by Martin and co-authors. And they define taxes as the obligation to contribute money or goods to the state in exchange for nothing in particular. These authors emphasize that even if paying taxes is an obligation that the state imposes on citizens, there is an implicit expectation of retribution, something in return. And this defines a particular relationship. The functioning of taxation in this sense goes beyond the market logic. It's not a price, it's not a fee. From an anthropological perspective, this implies that taxation is not primarily based on satisfaction for service received in exchange, but on recognizing a sovereign entity. Thus, it is conceived of as a sacrifice. In general, taxation is understood as the central instrument for implementing ideas of distributive justice. Therefore, we can see in different parts of the world that political campaigns, for instance, when facing issues such as the financing of social policy, financing of poverty reduction, or tackling inequality, they constantly refer to tax issues, tax reforms, because taxes are part of the core of the debates of that kind of policies. And therefore, who pays, how much, and why are questions not only related to technical issues, to arithmetical issues, but also and fundamentally to political ones. And as several authors argue, tax rates and burdens are a direct reflection of power. Who pays taxes and how much they pay is linked to important notions of justice, fairness, morality, legitimacy, and citizenship. Well, from a perspective of fiscal sociology, the role of state should be analyzed not only with regard to the state's ability to get resources, but also taking interactions between individual and state into consideration. In this sense, while some approaches emphasize the notion of state capacity as the ability to transform private resources into public wealth and the process of strengthening of the bureaucracy, the fiscal sociology approach is also interested in the recognition that the state obtains from citizens, which relates to the capacity to project an image of credibility and transcendent authority. In addition, it's analyzed to what extent a combination of coercion and consent allows the state to increase willingness to pay, which leads to higher levels of tax compliance. Lastly, according to Peters-Sloterdijk, since taxes are beyond a market logic, there is a need for a re-establishment of the moral spirit of democracy and creation of a political culture of the giver. This also relates to the fiscal bond and the need to pay attention to the dynamics of recognition between individuals and state. Well, most works analyzing taxes and state from a fiscal sociology perspective concentrate on countries of the global north. Therefore, I argue that a focus on Latin America, and my particular case in Chile, is relevant to compare the different trajectories of state building and the interactions between citizens and state that underlie the functioning of the tax regimes. Furthermore, Latin American countries are somehow particular in global comparison. Their tax systems are characterized by low tax revenue collection, a higher incidence of regressive taxes and mechanisms, little redistribution, and poor compliance. Moreover, Latin America is an example of the trade-off that represents fiscal havens in modern economy. On one hand, several Latin American countries lost an important percentage of tax revenue due to capital flight to tax haven. For instance, you can see here on the table on the left, Costa Rica, 28%, Venezuela, 16%, Brazil, 14%, Uruguay, 22%. On the other hand, more than 10 regional countries benefit from low or zero tax regimes and therefore increase the corporate tax revenue to the detriment of other countries. So you can see here small countries, insulates, islands like Bermuda, Bahamas, have a benefit of 100%. So the coexistence of winners and losers show the absence of regional coordination and the problems of tax competition. This partly explains the remarkable levels of tax evasion, which represents between 6% and 7% of GDP in Latin America and Chile. Well, so alongside business power, tax morale and levels of cooperation are gaining in importance in economic and policy debates and are part of the explanations which are needed to understand the issue of taxes in Latin America, and I argue in general for understanding taxation in different countries. Interactions between individuals and state, historical building of states, and the formation of citizen tax preference can actually contribute to explanations of tax system performance. And therefore, a fiscal sociology perspective can stimulate new avenues of research and provide crucial results to confront tax challenges at Latin American and global level. Well, here I switch to the paper which relates to tax non-compliance from the perspective of elites and based on empirical work dedicated to elites. And the research aims were, in this case, the following two: how do economic elites justify not paying taxes, and what are the perceptions and beliefs which sustain their arguments? And why Chile is interesting as a case to study this issue. Chile is normally considered one of the strongest states in Latin America, and taxation is one of the few spheres where it's possible to inquire the relation between the economic elite and the state. It's also interesting that taxation was actually omitted from the study and the analysis of public policy. After the return to democracy in 1990, taxation has been a neglected issue in policy debates, in spite low tax collection, the need to finance social spending, and problems of income tax non-compliance. This omission of the tax debate, as well as other controversial issues, was mainly due to an agreement between the business community, the right-wing coalition that came out of power after the dictatorship, and the center-left coalition that took power as a way to guarantee democracy. In the last decade, massive social demonstrations demanding the reduction of inequality and the financing of broader social policies have drawn attention to tax injustice, leading to a discussion of several forms and reforms that address the tax burden and tax structure, as well as the problems of tax non-compliance in some groups of taxpayers. And finally, I would also say that taxes are at the base of the growing perceptions of corruption in the public and private sectors in the Chilean society. And this was mainly associated with the revelation of scandals of influence peddling, conflicts of interest, and corruption related to tax evasion and avoidance, provoking a great national debate and leading to a discussion of new tax transparency and accountability laws. Well, I provide here some information regarding Chile economic concentration at the tax system, as you can see in the figure on the right side, which analyze income concentration using income tax declarations inequality has been a high and persistent problem in Chile at least the last 50 years, with the top 1% income shares varying between 10 and 18%. These estimations don't impute undistributed profits. Once they are imputed, income concentration even increases between 4 and 9 points higher for the top 1%. Chile also has low levels of redistribution, which is partly explained by the weak redistributive effects of the tax system and low social spending. The tax system in Chile is slightly regressive. The two main taxes are VAT, which in Chile is regressive, and a progressive income tax. Regressivity is verified in effective tax rates. The poorest 40% and the richest 10% of the Chilean population pay around 15% of their income in taxes. That is almost the same. Regressivity affects especially the income tax and is explained by tax exemptions and benefits that increase inefficiency and facilitate non-compliance. Regarding tax compliance, income tax evasion in Chile is much higher than VAT evasion. Some estimations show that income tax evasion reaches around 34%, whereas VAT evasion currently reaches 19%. But we also have additional information regarding avoidance. For instance, Bermuda, the island which was included in the list of tax havens in Latin America, appears, according to an OECD report in 2013, as the third largest investor in Chile. And there are also additional information regarding illicit outflows and misinvoicing, where Chile also takes part. There are also many works showing the high levels of business power and high opposition to tax reform on the side of elites to reduce income tax non-compliance. So here's the paper that I published 2019, and the method that I used were interviews, in-depth interviews with the elites. I conducted interviews with the economic elite, the scientific elite, the political elite, and tax advisors. And particularly concentrating on economic elites, the sample included shareholders, board members, consultants, and C-level managers in key positions at large companies. The interviews were selected following the position method, that is, high positions in different firms, consulting firms, etc. Two main criteria were used to select the companies, and two selection criteria were used to identify and contact elite positions. The interview guidelines were organized into 6 issues, and in this paper, I just presented results concerning the issue of non-compliance. And here I present some findings, and this slide shows a typology referring to orientation criteria to show that there are different dispositions, social disposition, attitudes to taxation within the economic elite. Unlike other typologies that refer to types of honest behavior, this one represents types of evaluations prevailing in the tax payment decision. Hence, action criteria include honesty alongside the other factors influencing tax compliance, such as tax knowledge, perceptions of fairness in the tax systems, and perceptions of citizens' just behavior, among others. Although adherence to the law assumes a common frame to criticize evasion, priorities of each action criteria inform how completely dissimilar tax scenarios coexist. First, those calling for avoidance criteria make an effort to differentiate between avoidance and evasion, since mixing categories risks labeling oneself as a potential offender. The reasoning visualizes tax planning as sizing the best possible conditions within the law. In this criteria set, legalism appears stronger than among those adopting less avoidance behaviors. Legalism exhibits many taxpayers' pragmatic reasoning. They do not question the performed action and consider law obedience a greater virtue. They do not acknowledge multiple possible interpretations, but hold the legislator responsible for the law's outcome and opt for a literal reading of the law, identifying opportunities and limits when paying taxes, where every effort to reduce the burden within legal boundaries is deemed legitimate. Second, boundaries criteria lead to tax planning too, but without prioritizing convenience or personal benefit. Business operations are meant to be efficient and rational, and the realm of tax payment also faces such demands. Even when this requires payment planning and the hiring of advisors, it is fully accomplished via compliance with the law and dismissing actions open to avoidance interpretation. Finally, non-avoidance criteria reduce centrality and set restrictions on motivation for reducing the tax burden. To use one interviewee's analogy, squeezing the lemon to obtain maximum performance is neither desirable nor necessary. This group's arguments, more than others, present a strong image of the creative action of avoidance by recognizing that there are multiple interpretations of the law while questioning legalism as an obedient attitude born out of inertia. Here I show just some examples of quotations, for instance, regarding orientation towards avoidance behavior. Nobody can brand you of misuse if you are within the law. I mean, you can walk, law reaches up to here, pointing out the table's edge. You can walk up to here, and that's what a businessman does. He walks up to here because here are the greatest benefits. Some of us are not such perfectionists, and we walk up to here, further in from the table's edge, and others walk up to here and make no use of it. Well, and here I show the repertoires of evaluation and legal tax compliance. I think I haven't said it before. I take this notion of repertoires of evaluation based on cultural sociology, particularly Michel Lamont and Laurent Thévenot. And I would just summarize here that repertoires of evaluation mean, in this case, mostly perceptions and beliefs. So I try here to systematize the logics and repertoires of evaluation regarding tax non-compliance, that is, attitudes toward evasion and avoidance. Although the interview's justifications combine miscellaneous explanations, not all of them are supported by the same logic. Disaggregation in different repertoires allows for a clear examination of not only the foundations of the relationship between subject and payment, but also different logics to understand, among others, what changes could potentially reduce non-compliance. This table identifies two types of repertoires and four predominant logics. First, a general distinction exists between interpretative and non-interpretative arguments. Among the interpretative ones, dominant narratives on evasion and avoidance consider them to be natural reactions to a certain state of affairs or a certain habitual human behavior. In these cases, a lack of guilt prevails. It is not clear what is responsible for avoidance and evasion, suggesting that it may be possible to alter behavior by changing the context, for example, through civic education, a major cultural development, or a modification of the system incentives. In this repertoire, two predominant logics exist, a civic ontological one and a regulatory one. In both cases, interviewees base their opinions on what they understand as facts, where non-compliance played out as an obvious reaction. First, civic ontological arguments suggest formative or cultural weaknesses which allude to ethical or educational difference between individuals or individualism. For instance, you can see here on the left, it is a matter of ethics, it is Chilean deviltry, or shameless people and scoundrels are everywhere. Second, a regulatory logic stresses institutional fragilities, where individuals may have little evaluative margin, and therefore tax planning is a rational option to endure ferocious competition, to take risks, and innovate with sufficient guarantees, or to respond to disparity in taxes between people and corporations, since, as an interview says, I would be stupid if I didn't do it.
Jorge, you have 5 minutes left.
Okay, thank you. On the other hand, in interpretative repertoires, evaluation is central beyond a verification of facts. It is less related to a natural state of affairs or a logical reaction towards an institutional configuration, but rather centers on a subjective analysis not necessarily based upon empirical observation. Here, tax non-compliance is not a negative consequence of certain incentives or ethical matters, but a result of a particular interpretation of state functioning, the need to contribute to the common good, or the belief that the law transcends individual will. Crucial here is that interpretative repertoires suggest that evasion and avoidance behavior will not necessarily change, even if the system's incentives or taxpayers' education do, since they might persist as narratives protected by common sense, which implies that solid proof would not be needed to uphold two predominant logics of action, a compensatory one and affirmative one. In compensatory logic, testimony and subjectivity are more clearly perceived than in previous justifications. Responsibilities are addressed, such as the malfunctioning of a public sector while wasting resources, legislation that inadequately considers the interests of some interviewees, or tax rates that are inconsistent with Chile's reality. Hence, in order to correct this imbalance, personal actions are modified to compensate for the system's failures. Finally, the affirmative logic is the only one that positively justifies non-compliance, since it indicates the system is actually working according to its original aims. Rather than being an anomaly, then, tax planning is productive for the country, as untaxed money ultimately results in growth and wealth. Well, to conclude, I have here just some slides of discussion and policy implications. One of the main aspects to discuss based on these findings is that non-compliance involves specific attitudes and dispositions. Elites have different tax behaviors as the rest of citizens do. These particular attitudes and dispositions mean that a specific strategy of compliance is displayed, one that can be put into practice in different institutional arrangements. Following Doreen McBarnett, this is creative compliance. The essence of creative compliance lies within the possibility of defining compliance as perfectly legal, simultaneously avoiding the expected law effect. Hence, the problem is understood as legal avoidance. An active legal work in this sense becomes indispensable and involves careful scrutiny of the law in order to seek out material for and actively construct alternative and innovative arguments and legal forms. The existence of an active legal work suggests that creative compliance can be actually a problem in different institutional arrangements, and therefore closing legal loopholes, increasing sanctions, and changing incentives should be complemented with strategies that aim to confront the subjectivities, values, and social dispositions that sustain the active legal work of creative compliance. This argument broadens the non-compliance debate and relates it not only to institutions, but also to discourses, narratives, and social practices, and allows to highlight that institutions and ideas are always interrelated. Ideas, values, and interests shape and are shaped by the institutional context. Thus, I argue that alongside institutional measures to face tax avoidance and tax evasion, such as regulation of tax havens, closing legal loopholes, new international tax regulations, stronger mechanisms of enforcement and regulation of unequal treatment of capital and labor, a different set of policies is also needed as a complement. This set of policies relates to civic and fiscal education, and although it already exists in most parts of the world, they should be deepened, reinforced, and if possible, constantly monitored. These policies should increase tax education in different domains or at different social levels. I put here just 3 examples. For instance, at school level, more and better tax and fiscal education is required. And here we should consider, for instance, international standards for tax education, and to take into consideration that tax education is as important as other areas. We also could think about the organizational level, and here we can mention, for instance, stronger tax ethics guidelines and regulations that could lead to tax guidelines similar to corporate social responsibility or ISO standards. And finally, at public level, institutional measures together with tax education should be accompanied by the reinforcement of social sanctions to face perceptions of injustice and unfair treatment. Here, I mean actions of symbolic enforcement that publicly shows that tax frauds and complex operations of aggressive tax planning are crimes that must be punished. Finally, tackling non-compliance by sanctioning evasion and showing lower tolerance to tax avoidance should be justified not only in terms of economic efficiency and the need of broader welfare policy, but also in terms of the renewal of the notion of citizenship, specifically cooperating citizenship and cooperating taxpayers. Such approach should highlight that higher tax awareness and a more engaged tax culture can drive greater demand for state transparency and the development of fiscal indicators and measures to show the use of tax revenue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jorge. Well, thank you to both of you, Polina and Jorge. That was quite an impressive overview from law studies and from sociology. So now we have about 40 minutes to react, discuss. That could also be crossed reactions from Polina and Jorge. I have many questions, but maybe we should begin with our public. So if someone has a question, a reflection, please introduce yourself so that we know where you are connected from. And then we can switch to other questions. So please feel free to.
I can make a cross comment if when necessary, but
okay. Well, let's see if someone from the public would like first to ask something, or yes, no, if not, yes, Polina. So please.
Thank you very much. It is very interesting because these are topics, the topics developed by Jorge are extremely studied in France by lawyers, and we have lots of literature on many of these topics. Just from the legal perspective, I would like to bring some maybe additional information. Well, the first thing that one shall keep in mind when we think about the redistributive function of law and the way taxes can reduce inequalities, etc. You have been talking about different exemptions that reduce the effective rate of taxation, and they do exist, of course, and in France it's the same. However, it is also connected with the fact that tax law in modern legal system, modern tax systems, has not only the purpose of collecting resources for state, it has also a purpose of influencing the behavior of taxpayers. So several exemptions or favorable tax regime can be motivated by these other non-budgetary purposes. For example, in France, you have very favorable tax regime if you invest in companies based in very poor regions, or if you work yourself and restore yourself a historic monument, a very old building, instead of the French state restoring it. So you see, you can have other reasons for these exemptions, and that makes it difficult to suppress all these exemptions. Wow. But indeed, we had the problem in France, for example, we had the progressive income tax, which is actually paid by 40% of taxpayers. So most of French taxpayers do not pay it, not because they're not compliant, but because they don't earn enough money and they don't contribute, or also because there are these exemptions. But you have the VAT, and we have social taxes in France, which are not progressive, which have flat rate, but there's almost no exemption. And so here everyone contributes. And from this point of view, it is, well, the interesting thing is that in France, it's considered as not equal taxes, because a tax is equal if it takes into account the ability to pay, and the progressive tax takes better into account the ability to pay. So the progressive income tax, even though it is paid only by 40%, even though there is this issue that many people don't earn enough to pay it, and other people have exemptions, etc., even though it's still considered the most equitable tax. Whereas VAT and social taxes with flat rate, no exemptions paid by everyone, are not considered as equal or as just as the progressive income tax. That's my first point. Second point is about the relationship between taxes and citizenship. It's in tax law, it's a rather old idea, but which doesn't work so much anymore, because in most countries, except US, as far as I know, and maybe there's one more country, I don't remember which one in the world, but otherwise the scope of application of tax law does not depend on citizenship. It depends on tax residence. So even if you are a foreigner but resident in France, you pay taxes in France. Even if you are a French citizen but you reside elsewhere. And the interesting thing is that if you are a French citizen, you vote, well, you elect representative in the French parliament who will vote tax law, but you won't pay the taxes. And the other way around, foreigners do not contribute to the election of representatives, so they have no impact on the voting of tax law, but they will pay the taxes. So you still have the connection with the citizenship for the production of legal rules, for the election of representatives in the parliament, but you don't have anymore this connection with the payment of taxes. So that was my second point. The most important point is about different forms of non-compliance you were talking about. In law, we have indeed a very precise classification of these types of behavior. And it's not specific to France. It's a vocabulary which is common to the European Union and to the OECD also. And you can distinguish indeed between the tax planning, which is legal, and it's the situation when you have several options to do what you want. For example, you want to transfer your estate to your children, okay? You can wait till you die, and then your children will get your estate and they will pay taxes on it. Usually state, at least French state, will want people to transfer their estate earlier. So if you transfer your estate to your children earlier, you pay less taxes, okay? So that's the option which is left up to the taxpayer by the legislator. And here, if the taxpayer makes the choice of the option which brings less taxation, it's considered as legal, normal, and is protected. We have a lot of case law by all possible courts, French, European, whatever you want, saying that that's an important right. The taxpayer should be able to choose the less taxable option, okay? The problem is raised. For example, if what is called tax avoidance in law or tax abuse is that if you say, I transfer my estate to children to pay less taxes, but actually you keep using it. So you create a legal appearance which does not correspond to the reality. In this situation, that is avoidance or abuse, and that is illegal, and there you have sanctions. And for example, tax authorities can disregard the fact that you say you have given a donation and consider the real situation and apply penalties, okay? And there is third possibility, which is called the evasion. Here, the law says you shall pay tax 20% rate on your income, you know it, and you don't pay it. Here, it's not just that you have created a legal appearance or anything, you just disregard law generally. That's, of course, illegal. And that is not so much from the legal perspective. We won't think about it about, are you willing to pay taxes or not? It's about compliance to the law. The law shall be the same to all for all, and everyone shall comply with the law, whether in tax area or in family law, company law, insurance law, whatever, you shall comply with the law. So you can contribute to the change of law if you disregard, if you consider the law is unjust, you can make political actions to change the law. But once law is voted by parliament, you shall comply with it. And the most important cases, of course, they are considered as criminal offense in French law and in most European countries, at least I know of. And that's certainly the most efficient solution that I can assure you. So last 10, 15 years, we've passed from the situation where we have almost never heard about criminal law in taxation to a situation where tax authorities regularly apply criminal law and regularly consider that the most significant violations of tax legislation are criminal offense. And we have many cases where even very well-known important people were condemned to criminal sanctions, were imprisoned. So that had a very significant effect on the tax compliance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paulina. Jorge, would not like to cross-answer?
Yeah, thank you very much, Polina, for these comments, which are actually very interesting. I would just mention some aspects, yes, regarding the tax exemptions. I agree. So my research not proposes the suppression of all exemptions, and I would say that the problem at international level is that there are certain evidence showing that exemptions tend to be used and benefit the higher incomes in different countries. So I understand that some tax exemptions are important because they serve different functions, cultural functions. There are a lot of examples related to architecture, heritage, etc. But I refer, of course, to those exemptions that affect mostly the regressive structure of tax systems. And I would say there are many exemptions that are mostly used by the economic elite, and tax advisors take advantage of these exemptions to reduce the tax burden of the elite. So that is, in my point, the most important issue to tackle regarding tax exemptions. And I would also say that of course, the tax law in modern society and the definition of tax regimes consider different functions. And I agree. Tax revenue is not the only one function. So regulation, redistribution are also important functions, and therefore the role of taxes in influencing the behavior of taxpayers is, of course, needed. I would just say also that the research which analyze inequality and economic concentration tend to show that tax systems have neglected the function of redistribution. I understand, and I know a bit the case of France, and I would say that France is somehow an exception, or one of the countries in which the redistributive function of taxation works. But in the global south and also in other European countries, the redistributive function of taxes is neglected and actually doesn't work very well. So I would say that this is my point is refers to those countries. In Chile, income tax has also these characteristics of exemption of part of the population, and actually in Chile, 75% of the population don't pay the income tax, 75%. So that's a lot. And I would say that it's important to include all the population, I would say in France, in Chile, and everywhere, and not regarding economic terms. It's not in terms of tax revenue increase, but in terms of citizenship. So if I am a citizen, I am contributing with taxes, regardless of the amount. So if I pay $1, €1, it's also important in terms of citizenship, because if I know that I am paying €1 or $1, I can request the state to change some things that I am not satisfying. So I think that's important to include all the population, not in economic terms, but in political terms. I agree that this issue is problematic between foreigners which can be taxpayers but not voters. This is a very interesting thing. I think that's very inspiring to conduct further research in the future. It's important because part of the interest of the fiscal sociology is to show that nowadays citizens have almost no obligations, and there are no obligated links between individual and state. So conscription was a typical obligated link. It's not more. And for many people, the paying of taxes is already not obligatory. There is a law, but it can be avoided at a certain point. So I mean, this is interesting, the tension between paying taxes and not voting. And finally, the legal appearance. So this is the essence of avoidance, and the problem is that I think it's very hard to detect, both for the French tax administration, for the Chilean tax administration, for all tax administrations. It's very hard to detect what types of operations are of legal appearance and what are real. And I think this is a challenge for modern tax regimes. Of course, compliance to the law is the most important thing. There are laws and they have to be complied. And that's more important than dispositions. But I think that dispositions can somehow make a problem or be a problem, since strategies to try to avoid the law are constantly perfectioning, improving, and therefore institutional designs have to take into account these social dispositions in order to have a better performance. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Jorge. Do we have questions or comments from our public? Dans n'importe quelle langue? Well, I have questions. So my first question for both of you would be, how does the current economic and security crisis affect the debate on international tax laws and its possibilities to go deeper into tax justice, which is, the context is quite new. It's from February on, but also we had the economic problem because of the pandemics before. Did we slower the pace regarding all the topics you mentioned, tax havens, problems of harmonization, etc.? So that would be my first question, which has I would like to know about the trend. We know the importance of these topics it's more important from about 30 years ago, but the current context is not really favorable to bettering the international level regarding tax justice. And the other one is maybe to compare better the cases of France and Chile. Chile is a rentist state, rentier, I don't know how you say that in English, un état rentier, and an extractivist state. And part of the incomes come from the extraction and exploitation of copper, which is a productive system quite different from the European one. And that's one of the reasons why, as Jorge said, it's interesting to look at the global South, which has really different rules about development, about a productive system, and in the end about tax system. So what do you think about that, Jorge? How does the fact of being an extractivist and a rentier state affects the tax system? And maybe the same for Polina, because the comparison between both systems is quite interesting. And finally, regarding social justice and the theory of social justice, well, we have John Rawls' theory of justice. And so the idea of we could decide what the rules should be at a precise moment of time before society begins to function. So do we have something like that, comparable to that in tax justice? I heard from Polina's presentation that we don't have such a general rule about what would be fair. And you said precisely that that there were Polina, would you like to begin?
Yes, could you just maybe repeat the end of your question, because I haven't heard it?
Yeah.
The end of the question was,
The last
do we have in tax law or tax justice something equivalent to John Rawls' theory of justice? You said in your presentation that the rules about fairness are quite pragmatic, but I was wondering if someone has written something about what would be the best tax rules under a veil of ignorance.
Thank you very much. Interesting, very interesting questions. Shall I start? Yeah, it's okay.
Oh.
Okay, perfect. Regarding the impact of the crisis, if I take your questions in their order, it's a very interesting question. But actually, well, my perception is that, my understanding is that in international context, we work very much on a kind of universal concept of tax fairness or tax justice. So it very strongly depends on the participation and the consent of all states, and if not all, at least very many of them. So the COVID crisis had actually positive impact, because everyone was understanding that states will need more money. So the issue was raising with even more strength and equity. So states were very willing to cooperate. And as far as I know, most meetings of the OECD and participating countries were organized online, but they were organized, and the work continued, and it worked very well. The war had a different effect, because it actually, it seems to me, it more split countries in blocks. And so it makes more difficult the universal content and the really multilateral work on projects. So we have had some news on the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, for example, this main OECD current projects, but we don't have any news since several months. And within the EU, we don't have a consent between member states, because the Commission has proposed a directive to implement the Pillar 2 of the OECD. And it looked like a very easy step, because all member states of the European Union are participating in the OECD project. So, and OECD announced that all states participating agreed. So we consider that, well, they all agreed. And the proposal of the directive actually just took the text of the recommendation of the OECD as such, without any changes. So it really, if you had an agreement on the OECD project, you must have agreed on the directive logically. But then states, and the states which politically can be rather different from the Western Europe, let's say Poland, Hungary, etc., were the states which disagreed on the directive. And to adopt a directive on taxation in the European Union, you need to have the consent of all states. So as long as at least one state disagree, the project cannot be adopted. And the thing is that there are states who refuse to give their consent, not for tax reasons, but because they make pressure and they negotiate something else in exchange. So you stop claiming the state of law reforms in our states, and then I will give my consent to the tax directive. So I think there are negotiations, political negotiations, which has nothing to do with taxation, that can go on the level of the European Union. But my answer, the war, yes, has a negative impact, on my opinion, on these multilateral reforms. As to the comparison of states that have other than tax resources and the states who really depend on tax resources, that is a very important issue, it seems to me. It's a kind of natural inequality among states. And I have been teaching tax law in Emirates, and same problem. So they don't have really taxation, and they don't really need taxation, and they don't really understand the purpose of taxation. And it was really a difficult way to teach a tax course to people who really didn't see the point of all that. And I know that they have introduced VAT because under the international political pressure, but mainly no one understood how it works. There was one person from tax authorities who was sent to do a PhD on the VAT in order to understand how it works. But it was really a complicated issue for them, and clearly done only under the international pressure. And I think they won't make any specific efforts to check the compliance, etc., etc. Or at least it was the feeling I've got from it. And that's the problem, because states who have no other resources, they clearly say that's unfair, because states who have other resources can have very favorable tax regime or even no taxation at all. And so they will attract many taxpayers, many taxable-based companies, intellectual property, generating income, etc., etc. Over the taxation below a certain level, they are without possible arms to respond. So that's true, but and it's an important point. And that actually brings us once again to this question whether international current debates are about universal justice or whether they are about opposing economic interests among states. Because Emirates say, well, it's not my problem that you depend on taxes. And interesting question. And to finish on the concept of tax justice, in law, you really have nothing about it, clearly. In case law, no, also nothing. You have OECD works which mention tax fairness. They don't also really define it, and I think it is difficult to define. And I think also in law, we have, well, first we have what is called standards. And standards, it's something which makes the limit, the burden, between what is acceptable and what is unacceptable. And this limit is usually sufficiently vague. For example, the classic example of a standard in French law is the concept of behavior as a good family father, the good chef of the family, le bon père de famille. No one knows exactly what does it mean to be a good chef of the family or a good father, but everyone understands that it's this kind of certain basic good sense, practical approach, no excessive risk, no really bad behavior, etc. And that leaves to the judge the possibility to adjust this concept and its content to the changes of society through the time, to the evolution of concept of the right behavior, what is acceptable, what is unacceptable, etc. And I think that, for example, the tax planning could be clearly acceptable for a good chef of the famille before, and it would be unacceptable now. So keeping the same standard, you can change the content of it. And secondly, at least in France, we have a culture of tradition, legal tradition, of not giving very specific legal definitions. In law, we prefer to give a general vision, a general definition, and then give the criteria which are kind of guidelines for the judge on the way it should be interpreted and construed. And then it's up to judge to apply it in a good, relevant way. Because we consider that the legislator, one, if you really try to define each situation, you will just never get to it, because the practice is so diverse. There's such a rich example of very different situations that you cannot really state on all of it. That's what Jorge was talking about with the situations of creating opportunities to reduce your tax burden. Of course, if you should take legal provision for each of this situation, you will just never manage to do it. So the idea is to give general guidelines, like in tax abuse, as we say in France, if tax authorities prove that the appearance, legal appearance, has nothing to do with the reality. That's enough, no matter how it is different, no matter what they have used to make it different, what kind of strategy or what kind of legal concepts, doesn't matter. As long as you had this difference between legal appearance and economic reality, you can ignore the legal appearance and tax according to the economic reality. So we're used to these general guidelines, general criteria. And I think that's what we have in tax law regarding taxation. We have the fact that it should be voted by parliament. You should have the vote of citizen. You should have the respect of principle of equality to pay tax justice.
Thank you very much, Polina. Jorge?
Well, thank you very much, Emmanuel. Just to add some additional points, I would say that, of course, the economic and security crisis have affected the national realities, and actually there are incentives for the states to seek for new strategies to finance the existing problems. So there is more pressure for redistribution and revenues, and we have also the evidence that most billionaires increased their profits during the pandemic. So what I see is that more countries are analyzing different strategies to increase enforcement, propose new taxes and new strategies to reduce inequality too. So, for instance, to me, it's interesting the work by the OECD in terms of this minimum tax rate, which is an additional effort to the BEPS initiative, the Base Erosion and Profit Shifting Initiative. So I would say institutional coordination is increasing, but we also have to keep in mind that there are coordination of economic power too, and the political will to make important transformation is very hard. So I think that this minimum tax rate is important at international level, but there are many critics saying that this tax rate is still very, very low when considering the economic profit that that big firms have at international level. And here, actually, I had a question for Polina, because I think that's also interesting, the role that the civil society is playing in make this pressure. I think, for instance, the case of Starbucks, the boycott in the UK many years ago, probably 10 years ago, but more recently, it created this initiative for changing the corporate tax at international level. There is new pressures associated with foundations facing gender taxation. So there are a lot of new initiatives, foundations coming from civil society, demanding a new role of taxes and a more law harmonization and possibilities to conform a more fair legal framework. So what's the role of the civil society organizations in making this change faster or possible? That's my question. And regarding the difference between France and Chile, or more generally at the global South level, of course, I think that characteristics such as Chile or other rentier countries and extractivist countries, I would say this is a very important factor because it sheds some light on the different trajectories of formation of states. And we can see in Chile that these characteristics, rentier state, extractive state, configured the historical evolution of a restrained function of taxes. So this constraint function gives taxation just a very limited function. And this is important because, for instance, in Chile, the main reason to avoid the payment of 7% of population to exclude from income tax was charity. So rich groups don't want to make excessive pressure for the poor groups of the population, and therefore they were historically exempted from income tax. And therefore it was thought that taxes should come from copper and extractivism. But if we analyze the tax burden, the really tax burden and effective tax rates, we can see that actually the poor groups pay more or the same than the top groups. So in a sense, this is important to analyze the historical trajectory and how different groups have understood the role of taxes and the arguments to sustain different tax structures. So that's all on my side. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Just before asking Paulina to answer, do we have a comment or a question from the public? And then Paulina, and then we'll finish the session.
Thank you. You do raise very interesting questions, and thank you very much. About the social pressure, it is, I think, extremely important in practice. And I heard a declaration of the tax director of Yahoo, it seems to me, who was saying several years ago, who was saying that they had a control by tax authorities and who didn't raise any specific issue. Well, at least it was his declaration. I don't know how true it is, but it is what it was what he said, that they paid all taxes legally due in France. But they understood that their usual users considered that they don't pay enough taxes. And therefore, they were ready to increase the amount of taxes paid in France. It strikes me because in France, taxes are raised on the ground of law. So if there is no legal ground for the payment of more taxes, I don't understand how it works. So either it's not a honest declaration, which is also possible, or I don't see how it can work. But that, for me, raised two interesting points. First, it's clearly about the reality of pressure by, so I think it's not the fact that it's social society, it's about the fact that it's a pressure of consumers, of users. And indeed, if your clients start to boycott you, you don't have any more business. Your clients is your source of income, first of all. So I think it's fundamental for any business to have your clients or your consumers who follow you and who are ready to buy your products or services. So if they say we buy it only if you pay enough taxes in France, of course you will pay enough taxes in France. Now, the problem is that if you have a distinction or you have differences between what is perceived by your clients as the sufficient amount of taxes paid in France and what is established by law, I still consider that law should prevail. Maybe you have to change the law to adjust it to social expectations. But I'm very much afraid, maybe it's because I'm a lawyer, it's possible, but I'm very much afraid that if you start to levy taxes, not on the ground of legal provisions, but on the ground of your perception of justice, of sufficient or insufficient amount of money, it will be anarchy. And it can, give good results in some cases and give catastrophic results in other cases. That's first point. Second point is also about the thing that there's also another issue, very important for me, which we should not forget, is that it's also about who can better use this money. Because the issue of more you pay taxes, better it is one of possible economic theories. It's not necessarily all economic theories do not agree on that. And you can also say that companies that keep money and don't pay enough taxes, they can use this money to make research, which is true to a certain extent for companies in digitalized economy who have huge pressure to innovate very, very quickly. So they have enormous expenses for research. they will use this money for the formation of their employees, to create employment, etc., etc. So you can also have arguments about these companies keeping this money and using them maybe in a more efficient way than the state. We can debate on this, but I mean, there's also this question, and that's about the minimum rate of taxation. People who say that it's not enough, maybe, but it's not about compliance. You had the issue of compliance and you had the issue of the rate of taxation. And that's, for me, two different issues and two different debates. Yes, taxation of groups, last remark, and I'll finish on it. One should also keep in mind, as we were discussing it several minutes ago, legal personalities, companies, groups of companies who don't have actual legal personalities, but who are formed by several legal personalities. These are legal fictions. So all money produced by these companies belong to their shareholders. And for instance, in France, we have existed for more than 20 years without any corporate income tax. There was only general income tax on natural persons, no corporate income tax, because corporation is a fiction. So at some point you tax it on the level of the natural person. So when we talk about the level of taxation of groups, you actually should also keep in mind the possible level of taxation or non-taxation of the shareholders and natural persons who actually are the real owners of all this welfare in the final step. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much to Polina Cazals from University of Savoie Mont Blanc and Jorge Atria from University Diego Portales in Chile. Before we close this session, I would like to thank l'Association Française de Sociologie and my colleagues, and particularly Abdoulaye Diallo, who's in charge of the organization. I would also like to thank, on behalf of David Mélo, le Centre de recherche en droit Antoine Fabre de l'Université Savoie Mont Blanc. David says again he's deeply sorry, but there was a problem with his computer, but he's been there all the time. And I would also like to thank COES, el Centro de Estudio de Cohesión y Conflicto Social, based in Chile, and which is part of the organization of this seminar. So I don't know if you heard the people mowing the lawn here, because it's as we are in the south, it's spring. So I wanted to send a few degrees to all people in the north, but Marcelo is here in the south too. So the session was recorded, so if anyone wants to listen to it again, we'll try to put it online on COES website. And thanks again to everyone, and thank you very much, Abdoulaye, for making this possible. So see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you for inviting. We have another session in December. Maybe we can share the link if you want to participate. Thank you very much, Polina and George, for your participation. And thank you, the public. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Je vous remercie. Thank you very much.
Merci.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.